Okay. And so without further ado, I'm very pleased and honored to introduce our presenter this evening. Dr. Christian Gruber is professor of Islamic art and the former chair in the History of Art department at the University of Michigan, as well as the founding director of Khamsin, Islamic Art History Online. Her scholarly work explores medieval to contemporary Islamic art, especially figural representation, depictions of the Prophet Muhammad, manuscripts and book arts, architecture, modern visual and material cultures, and ecological arts. She's currently working on her next book entitled Elements of the Middle East, Art, Faith, and Ecology. And so please give your attention and interest to Dr. Gruber. Welcome.
Thank you so much, Marion. It's a real pleasure to be here among birders and other enthusiasts of all things avian. I'm really tickled and honored to be able to talk for the Audubon Society. This is my first time. Usually I run in art history circles, so this is a real delight for me. And it also gives me a chance to really test drive a part of a chapter for my next book that Marion just described. So I will be really happy and grateful for any questions or comments and corrections in the Q&A. So without further ado, let me go ahead and share my screen and begin the talk. Okay, I hope this looks good for everybody, but I'm sure you'll holler if it doesn't. All right. So the title of my talk today is Hima in the House, Avian Architecture Across the Islamic World. The topic of birds and non-human animals in general has yet to take a more prominent place within the discipline of Islamic art, architecture, and material culture. Until today, few are the studies that have focused on avian architecture, such as this pigeon tower located in Egypt's Dakhla oasis. These bird edifices tend to be made of humble materials like rammed earth, mud bricks, clay vessels, and tree branches, and so often are classified as vernacular, regional, or even makeshift architecture. Additionally, bird houses' rugged and at times isolated settings, as well as their non-human occupants, have largely occluded them from scholarship on Islamic architecture, which has tended to focus on architectonic masterpieces built by and for humans. And yet, birds and their abodes have long contributed to the biomorphic landscape and built environment of the entire globe. Stretching from Morocco to India, birdhouses within Islamic lands attest to the thriving of avian architecture across the centuries. Generally speaking, birdhouses provide a type of sanctuary or refuge, or what is called Hima in Arabic, dedicated to protecting avifauna and the related regions, including lands cultivated for human sustenance or set apart as biodiversity reserves for non-human survival. Today, avian himas can broaden the scope of reconciliation ecology, which intersects with conservation and sustainability movements. These efforts can be tied to Islamic traditions that are known as Islah, namely peacemaking or settlement among individuals. Today, I will argue that Islah or reconciliation can be extended to encompass interspecies relationships through the notions of wholesomeness and harmony. Thus, Himma and Islah, as conceptualized within Islamic philosophical and ecological thought, join, expand, and critically nuance the insights drawn from animal studies, eco-art history, and the post-humanities, carving out a new zone for scholarly intervention at a critical ecological moment in time. If avian abodes can function as sanctuaries for interspecies encounters, then they can also provide a material and architectural arena for reconciliation between humans and non-human animals. Three different birdhouse typologies attest to this potential. First, nook and crannies. Second, pigeon houses and towers. And third, stork nests on various structures such as walls, mosques, and minarets. And today I'll note that I'll be speaking about the first two, so the built structures, and I don't have time for stork architecture, what in the book I call siconiforms. Whether impromptu or purpose-built, these various types of birdhouses display an array of forms and functions. In more recent years, they also intersect with vulnerable places and peoples, thereby highlighting the interconnection between endangered animals and at-risk communities in Muslim-majority lands. Finally, birdhouses can help us articulate and perhaps implement a more integrated vision of the creaturely world through the thematic lens of the Islamic safe haven, or Hima, hence propelling a conceptual shift from the anthropocentric to the zoocentric at a time when we are being called upon to act as more sensitive stewards of the earth, its natural resources, and all of its indwellers. This conceptual shift, I further argue, can be set into motion by a detailed observation and scholarly study of Islamic material culture, including those that, up until today, have been by far and large flown over in favor of man-made masterpieces intended for human occupancy. So let's dig in. The first and most basic birdhouse consists in a hole that is used for avian roosting. While cracks in mountain ridges and fissures in rock formations serve this purpose without any artificial intervention, humans nevertheless have altered the natural environment by chiseling nooks and crannies out of lapidary surfaces. Artificial hollows carved out specifically to host birds result from a subtractive building technique which mimics cave dwellings for humans on the one hand and modern archaeological work on the other. Beyond such extractive techniques, these dugout abodes serve as a means of supporting permanent avian dwelling. They therefore sustain bird life and diversify the animacy of our surrounds, expanding it to include a large population of winged entities that coo, sing, flutter, and fly. Chief among them are pigeons, which couple for life, nest together, produce broods of offspring, and leave heaps of high-quality guano for humans to collect and put to excellent agricultural use. Whether geologically formed, accidentally available, such as in tree cavities, or intentionally chiseled, bird hollows are found across the Islamic world. Human-made avian alcoves prove most especially a hallmark of the natural landscape and built environment of Cappadocia. Located in the central Anatolian region of today's Turkish Republic, Cappadocia resembles a lunar landscape because of its tough rock ridges and volcanic peaks, which are known as fairy chimneys. Now a prime tourist site visitable by land and balloon, the area was long inhabited by Christian communities, which carved places of living and worship out of its craggy peaks and sought refuge in its subterranean cities all the way up to the early 20th century. By the 1200s, members of the Muslim community also began to settle the area once it came under Seljuk and then Ottoman control. And finally, for many centuries, and especially from the 18th century onward, the local inhabitants carved out many pigeon cavities out of the volcanic rock, especially in the valleys of Soğanlı and Güvercinlik. So here is Soğanlı and here is Güvercinlik. The latter sobriquet, that is Güvercinlik, literally means pigeon house in Turkish. And therefore the area's name is an apt descriptor for its bustling flocks of pigeons and its panoply of chiseled dovecotes. These pigeon houses, or güvercinlik in Turkish, embody the biomaterial process of addition by subtraction. In other words, they multiply and speciate the architecture of dwelling through the strategic removal of soft rock. The Cappadocian avian alcoves or niches, and they're known as niche in Turkish, are essentially square cubbyholes that fulfill basic avian needs with regards to location and size. As for the location, the alcoves must be built up high. Let me see if I have a, here we go. I'll keep it, yeah. They have to be built up high, away from the threat of humans and wild predators, and they must face away from the winter wind and towards the sunlight to maintain a comfortable ambient temperature for the birds throughout the year. Additionally, they must be protected from rain by either being chiseled into the tuff or, as you can see here, with a protruding rock canopy, though I have to say that it's likely that there was a facade here which has since collapsed. So imagine more rock and these cubbyholes in the interior of the rocky outcrop. As for size, these chambers must be big enough to accommodate a pair of pigeons, since the birds roost and brood for life. Studying the heights of the fairy chimneys with incised checkerboard patterns, these rock-cut modular units hosted thousands of paired pigeons and their offspring, whose collected guano proved especially favorable for the growth of grapes in the area during the Byzantine and Ottoman periods. And still today, Cappadocian wine is very famous, and it's a prime tourist souvenir. While at times pigeon houses appear as if large-scale latticework chiseled out of the rock face, at others they are scattered in smaller clusters across the lithic landscape of Cappadocia. For example, in the Soanlı Valley, entry points are clustered somewhat unevenly, as you can see here. However, their concavities connect within the rock proper, into which humans can enter through locked doors in order to collect the rich droppings. So here you can't see any of the doors, but there is a side entrance, and so you can go into the rock. Once you're inside, the bird condominiums are connected across several stories, and they provide birds with wooden perches. And here you see some perches that are still standing and others that have fallen to the ground. And besides these perches, these bird hollows include roosting alcoves, feeding platforms, and water basins. So now what I'm going to do is show you a short video that I shot so you can get an idea of the space, and I'll describe it to you as I move along. So this is an interior of a güvercinlik on the third floor inside a rock. This is a window that's closed, and it has a few entrance points for the pigeons to come in. These are all the roosting nests. You'll notice some round hollows. Those are for the perches to connect between the lateral walls and that central pillar. Here you have more roosts and those small circular impressions that would have connected with perches. Then you have feeding troughs. And to get an idea of the labor of climbing up, this is the hole that I myself had to climb through. And Soanlı stretches 10, 15 stories high, so it goes on and on. On the outside, the avian alcoves are not just chiseled in the rock. They also include at times stone-built elements that provide entry holes that are only big enough to accommodate a single pigeon, hence preventing the intrusion of larger predators such as eagles, hawks, foxes, and weasels. So here we have also these cut stones, and the entry points are here, and they're just big enough for one pigeon. At some times, such as in these dovecotes in the Gomera Valley, they include large archways, triumphal elements bespeaking of the soaring value granted by humans to the house's winged occupants. This conjoining of the subtractive and additive method of stone construction is geologically specific and functionally fitting, And it also finds a close parallel in the human cave dwellings of Cappadocia as well. Besides rock cutting and stone insetting, this type of avian landscape architecture also engages the painterly mode through the accentuation of the hollows in pigment. Halo-like, this framing feature fulfills a number of purposes, among others the capturing of the pigeon's attention so that they can visually distinguish their homes within an enclave of earthen cliffs and outcrops. Beyond offering chromatic variegation, the chalky paint that you see here, which often encircles these hollows, is made of white lime and egg white plaster. It thus functions as a lubricant coating, that is, a smooth and slippery surface past which a serpent, a weasel, or a field mouse cannot climb. In other words, they'll just slip right on down. Along with the petite entry holes, this sleek veneer provides a second defensive device for the avian occupants, disallowing climbing predators in search of food, such as pigeon flesh and pigeon eggs. Under the Byzantines and Ottomans and all the way until today, lime washing is well known for its ability to deter vermin and even eliminate mosquito eggs and larvae lying in the walls of dovecotes. And we know that that was used also in England and Scotland. Plastering, whitewashing, and other bird-rearing knowledge during the Byzantine and Islamic periods built upon Roman knowledge and traditions. Such avifaunal practices survive not only in Roman visual representations of pigeon houses in mosaics, but also in Latin language agricultural treatises, including those penned by Columella, Varro, and Palladius from the 1st century BC to the 5th century CE. Often bearing the title De Re Rustica, or Concerning Rural Matters, these texts include detailed information about pigeon housing, feeding, meat, and manure as an element of Roman agricultural and economic activities. As for the pigeon houses proper, Palladius informs his readers that their walls must be polished and whitewashed, while Varro states that this plastering disallows ingress to mice and lizards. Moreover, for his part, Columella specifies that this plastering should be white as, quote, this species of birds, that is pigeons, is particularly fond of that color, of the color white. This latter comment takes us out of the defensive dimension to engage more seriously with the issue of avian delectation or aesthetics. As scientists have shown in recent years, chromatic variegation and white hues prove particularly attractive to birds' eyes, whose retinal cones are sensitive to light and color contrast. That birds see near the ultraviolet also suggests a visual field and experience well beyond our human perception and understanding. This wholly different aesthetic world remains largely unaccounted for in our received approaches to age-old questions concerned with beauty and therefore what constitutes a work of art. Bypassing Hegel and Kant, whose philosophical writings involve notions of the beautiful, divine, and universal, I instead contend that the bird world constructs its own judgment of taste based on a system of vision that overrides and outshines that of the human realm. This syntax of sight is indigenous and not extrinsic to the avifaunal world, and hence it requires no human valuation or validation. In the scenario of a zoocentric assessment that eclipses an anthropocentric one, virtuosity lies not in the talent of artists or the discernment of patrons, but rather in the artful luminosity of matter as it is processed in the eyes and minds of the winged entities that inhabit the world. To the avian viewers and users, the dovecotes of Cappadocia thus may not look merely as if ragged holes outlined by white plaster, but rather as if a lustrous star-like studding of the highest aesthetic order and appeal. This said, from the Roman period until today, humans have channeled their creativity and delight in crafting avian abodes. Not infrequently, they approached this utilitarian endeavor artfully, transforming chiseled bird hollows into structural artworks, as can be seen here in the Byzantine Çanlı Kilise church located in Akhisar, also in Cappadocia. According to the scholar Robert Osterhout, these bird roosts were originally hidden by a now collapsed facade, and it was not unusual for the courtyards of Byzantine monastic residences to include dovecotes in their upper levels. So this is probably the upper level of a courtyard that has filled up with soil, and that courtyard belonged to a Christian monastery. These carved cubbyholes combined with other architectural elements, such as columns, doorways, and domes, as well as a variety of chiseled and painted motifs, including crosses. And here you can see a chiseled cross. The motifs also include representations of wheat, as you can see here. Here's some wheat, plants, flowers, and the Holy Spirit as a dove. The latter a most apropos motif for avian abodes included in Byzantine chapels and churches, a number of which were not repurposed into mosques during the Islamic period onward, but instead transformed into birdhouses through the carving of roost nests. So many of the Christian churches and monasteries were transformed into churches when Islam appeared in Cappadocia, but some also remained avian abodes. So the churches could be one or the other. They could be birdhouses or they could become mosques. During the 18th and 19th centuries in particular, the dovecote's white, smooth, and anti-rodent surfaces offered their makers blank canvases for creative elaboration and enjoyment. Various motifs can be found in the Cappadocian dovecote repertoire at this time, creating a Turco-Islamic avian folk arts of sorts. The designs range from ornamental to vegetal, calligraphic, and figurative. For example, flat weave carpet-like motifs, such as chevrons, lozenges, and even tassels, as you can see here, often encircle the bird holes, and here are the holes. The patterns echo local textile traditions, extracting them from human cave dwellings and weaving them with pigments around the dovecote's entry holes instead. So here I show you a human cave dwelling, and you'll see that the carpet now goes from that dwelling to a painting on the outside of a birdhouse. At times, these fabric patterns include dates of execution, their owners' names, praises to God, to Allah, such as Allahu Akbar or Bismillah, for example, plants and flowers in vases, and transportation animals such as horses and camels. Last but not least, some of the birdhouse's white plaster coating also include depictions of humans engaged in various activities, including here a hunter with bows, and yes, they hunted various animals and sometimes even birds. And here, this is painted in a kind of red earth that's high in ferrous oxide, locally known in Turkish as yosha. And here in this case, you see a horseback rider who's afoot and two men who face each other with shields and swords in the air. So let's focus on these two men right here. The latter depiction likely represents a folk performance known in Turkish as the Kılıç Kalkan game or dance. It belongs to a larger tradition of sword dances around the globe and known in the Arab world as Raqs as-Sayf, or dance with a sword. Within Ottoman and Turkish lands, the most famous Kılıç Kalkan, or sword and shield dancers hailed from the city of Bursa, joining international festivals. While such a popular performance traditions are not well attested to in Cappadocia, the birdhouse painting strongly suggests that sword and shield dances likewise were a staple of Anatolian culture during the 18th and 19th centuries. They thus record a fleeting and intangible art, expand the painterly realm to the surfaces of rocks, and put to picture a larger ecology that conjoins humans, animals, and vegetal life. These nested spheres impel us not to underestimate the contribution of avian art and architecture to Islamic cultures, because an entire biogeomorphic organism emerges, creating a feedback loop and animating an integrated state of co-being. Acting as a refuge, or himma, for birds, while also promoting a type of reconciliation, or islah, that promotes mutual living and dependency, the Cappadocian dovecotes support what Gregory Bateson calls a connectivity ontology. This vital form of existence bands sentient beings together and anchors them in the earth, whence birdhouses emerge as but one example among the many expressive cultures and vibrant matters that have flourished across the world. The nested spheres of life that conjoin people, birds, and the environment likewise materialize in the pigeon towers located within today's Iran, Egypt, and Turkey. These built and freestanding avian homesteads functioned, and in some cases still very much function, much like the Cappadocian crannies, namely to provide a refuge for pigeons whose valuable organic manure was collected to fertilize soil and that was also used as a mordant to tan leather. In this avian architectural corpus, the better studied pigeon towers are those of Iran, which appear in Safavid or 16th and 17th century period textual sources and are known in Persian as pigeon houses or pigeon towers, kabuterkhane or burj kabuter in Persian, in Farsi. In Farsi. Pigeon towers in Arab lands are today called Burj al-Hammam, or in Egypt, Burg al-Hammam, in Egyptian dialect. But beyond this Arabic language name, I would also like to flag that they have local Berber or Amazigh languages and settings as well. And finally, the same holds true for the wild pigeon houses used by the Kurdish communities of Turkey, especially those settled in the Ahmed and Diyarbakir area, where these avian abodes are called borhane in Kurmanji Kurdish, a term meaning wild pigeon house. From the rough-hewn to the exuberant, these purpose-built avian structures cut across both social classes and architectural categories, stretching here all the way from Morocco to the eastern Kurdish lands. Iranian pigeon houses tend to cluster in the Isfahan and Yazd provinces, and they have captured the attention of scholars due to their large size and number. Quite poetically, in her study dedicated to these structures, the scholar Elizabeth Beasley describes the kabuterkhanes, the pigeon houses, as if they were, quote, naval forts stranded hundreds of miles inland, or else chessmen waiting the mastermind of a remote giant, end quote. In centuries prior, European visitors to Iran were also taken by these avian edifices, illustrating and writing about them in their travel books, especially from the 1700s onward. Among them, the German naturalist and explorer Engelbert Kaempfer wrote about his experiences in Iran, such as a royal procession that he witnessed at Hizar Jarib, so the royal palaces of Isfahan, whose depiction here includes a concordance of its participants as well as a pigeon tower surrounded by its avian denizens. So this is the procession. And what I mean by concordance is that everyone has a letter, and then there's a concordance where you know who's who. It's explained in the text. And the major architectural centerpiece here is a pigeon tower with the pigeons flying to and fro. As one might guess from this illustration, Safavid pigeon houses were no plebeian matter. To the contrary, they belonged to landowners who had to pay the ruler a tax on the manure gathered from these towers, and which they sold to farmers who used the dung to increase their yields, in particular of watermelons and melons growing in the otherwise nitrogen-poor soil of the Isfahan plains. These structures thus functioned as architectonic symbols of wealth and abundance, much like the mansions that house humans. Furthermore, the French jeweler and traveler Chevalier Jean Chardin makes mention of the pigeon houses in his voyage book of 1811. He notes that pigeon guano is the best fertilizer for melons, and that to his mind the most beautiful pigeon houses in the world are those of Iran. He goes on to state that there are over 3,000 pigeon towers around the city of Isfahan alone, all made to house birds and to gather their droppings. He then illustrates and describes their major structural elements and features, including that they are made of mud brick, covered in plaster and lime, and completely covered in their interiors with holes that function as bird nests. He goes on to note that anyone can build a tower as long as they pay the manure levy, that this manure is called chalhuz here. The word chalhuz in Persian today means bird waste and chicken excrement. So I think that's what he's referring to. And that this chalhuz is sold by the bisti, and that actually is a tiny weight measure that Iranians use to measure the weight of coins. So it's like a milligram, essentially. Like Chardin, other travelers also report that, unlike their European counterparts, the Iranians did not use dovecotes to raise pigeon meat products, such as squabs and eggs, or engage in pigeon hunting. So Europeans were using dovecotes for access to pigeon meat and to hunt pigeons. Instead, they use them to collect the guano. Other reports specify that a single Isfahani pigeon tower could hold up to 14,000 birds each. Even if we are to lower this number to 10,000 birds per house, then we can calculate that with 3,000 towers in total around Isfahan, the skies of the area would have hosted about 30 million wild pigeons in the 18th and 19th centuries, an avian population that has since collapsed in part due to the introduction of chemical fertilizers and mass industrial agriculture. So imagine 30 million pigeons flying overhead, and that would have been your experience of this area. Before then, however, pigeon towers served as architectural manufactories of what my Cappadocian interlocutors today call pigeon clouds. So people in Cappadocia, when they see all these pigeons in the sky, they refer to them as pigeon clouds. And you can see those pigeon clouds actually illustrated in those earlier sources. So large and omnipresent were these bird flock nebulae that I am told the Anatolian skies could hardly be seen some decades ago. Incubated and diffused by the carved and built avian abodes scattered across the Islamic world, such striking visual, sonic, and bioclimatic effects are now largely unknown territory for us humans of the Anthropocene. But those who came before us were heavily outnumbered by birds, a phenomenon that must have caused awe, reaffirmed the bounded position of humans among the created species, and aroused in them, in us, the pre-modern us, a deferential and integrated view of the living world. As for the towers themselves, a few dozen of which remain extant nowadays in Iran, they are usually round and fort-like in construction. They include a single elevated door that is usually sealed and accessible by ladder only for the once yearly spring collection of guano. So here you see how elevated the door would have been. And when in use, this would have been sealed shut because this is expensive. It's a treasury of expensive goods, the guano. The door's closure not only protected the financially valuable droppings housed therein, but also served to prohibit ground vermin like snakes from crawling into and feasting on the birds and their eggs. In order to counter such predators, the towers are also coated with a layer of rough straw mud mix, which is known as um, kagil in Persian, and also with a smooth plaster known as gach in Persian. Their surfaces too slippery for creatures to slink up or find footholds. Fenestration also is minimal, strengthening the building's impenetrability. Instead, small holes appear here and there, while the so-called pepper pot turrets, these are called pepper pot turrets right here, here, and here. While these pepper pot turrets at the top of the structure offer a brick lattice work to permit pigeons a snug entry into the building, effectively swatting away larger birds of prey from their targeted meals. And finally, some wooden perches stud the upper portions of the towers. I hope you can see these perches here, here, and here, thus providing ledges for pigeons to alight and take off as they wish. Put otherwise, these wild birds were protected from harm and not incarcerated in these sculptural edifices. Instead, they came and went freely. The human concept of owning animals, here involving curtailed custodianship or stewardship, what is known as khilafa in Arabic, to be the steward of something, instead of just raw power and simple possession, what is known as mulk in Arabic. So, if anything, the Iranian pigeon towers generate an interspecies joint property expressed in architectural form. Such towers suggest new frameworks of inquiry within the post-humanities by decentering the human being, recentering the animals, and placing both of them within their traditions, including at its intersection. Moreover, as Cudworth and Hobden remind us, such a method forces a reappraisal of ourselves as vulnerable yet vibrant, like myriad other critters and ecologies, as well as sensate animals that are embedded in the worlds of others. This conceptual move, they further stress, does not require a rejection of the human, but a shrinking of the Western frame of being human. Concomitant with this shrinking of anthropocentrality, I contend that this shift also requires an enlargement of the definitional boundaries of the scholarly field of art history, including the subfield of Islamic art and architecture. In other words, we have to make way for the birds. Indeed, the pigeon towers cannot be ignored as trivial guano collection spots, even as their scale and craftsmanship turn them into veritable manure mansions. Looking to their interiors, it becomes clear that these structures conjoin the functional with the ornamental, the instrumental with the aesthetic. Their walls are covered from head to toe with pigeon hollows, providing the maximum number of shelters for the birds, with a minimum amount of building materials, in this case, as you can see, mud brick. As Beasley once again notes, the sequence of solid and void creates a mesmeric quality in the buildings. One might also point to their thousand weave, or hazar buf in Persian, pattern, a modular brick patterning that stretches back many centuries in Islamic lands and is best epitomized in the 10th century tomb of the Samanids, which you see here, that is located in the city of Bukhara in modern-day Uzbekistan. Here you can see the canonical structure has a whole series of mud brickwork on its exterior and also its interior, and it looks quite similar to this birdhouse. So to this funerary structure right here can be added the corpus of Safavid pigeon towers, whose design approach likewise uses the thousand weave brick technique, but in this case not only for decorative purposes, but more importantly, to efficiently optimize materials and spaces for avian inhabitation. The interiors of the pigeon houses not only include hollow niches in the thick walls of the towers, but also a series of ledges that provide landing and resting pads for the pigeons. And those ledges are here. I hope you can see these protruding ledges, and here's some others. As the scholar Al-Gamai points out, these clapped pyramid projections enabled the birds' rearward bodies to discard their droppings onto the floor rather than in their nest cavities. This serviceable design is not without its honeycomb or kaleidoscopic look, made all the more dazzling through the hollow studding of the walls, the structure's walls, inner pillars, and even its drums escalating up to the domical roofs. In the minimalism and barrenness of the now vanished bird colony, the mud niches and decks create a light and dark chiaroscuro, or light and shadow effect. Furthermore, when viewed from below, as is the case here, the pigeon posts endow the building's interior with a prismatic effect reminiscent of the abstract swellings and superpositions typical of modern optical art. Not a mere trompe-l'oeil, so a testing of your eye. However, the vibrations that you think you're seeing here are not are not merely visual conundra, but also could result from real movement. So speaking about vibrations here, when the birds panicked upon the entry of a predator, imagine that up to 14,000 of these birds would flap in a frenzy and fly in unison, creating a seismic pulse that often would cause cracks in the tower's walls. Today, this concern, namely the structural damage that you can see here, here, and here, caused by natural decay and at times terror-stricken flocks in flight, and at other times earthquakes, continues to challenge even the most expert conservators in Iran. But moving beyond Iranian lands, pigeon towers also act as pivots of desert valley and oasis cultures in North Africa. To the west of the Nile Valley and even abutting the Libyan border, these structures participate in the local economies as bioarchitectural and ecological fulcrums. In these relatively isolated settings, the pigeon guano ensures both a high quality and yield of palm tree dates, as well as other agricultural products such as olives, figs, and other fruits and vegetables. This is especially the case for the oases in Egypt of Dakhla, which is down here in the Western Nile Desert, the Fayoum, which is closer to Cairo off the Nile, and also Siwa right here, which is very close to Libya. While these areas have been inhabited by a mix of Arab farmers and rural villagers, they're known as fellahin in Arabic, as well as Bedouins. They also include, and most especially in Siwa, a still thriving Amazigh or Berber community for whom pigeon towers enter into a larger indigenous landscape of earthen practices and artistic cultures, which are increasingly at risk due to climate change and human activity. And for the case of Siwa, also the decline of the Amazigh community because of not just industrialization, but Arabization. Setting aside such challenges for the moment, let us now explore in greater detail these avian abodes in two of the half-dozen oases in Egypt's western desert. And today I'm only going to focus on Dakhla and Fayoum because Siwa deserves a much more time. Literally meaning the inner oasis, Dakhla or Dakhla has served as a zone of human settlement since at least 2000 BC. Through the Pharaonic, Roman, and Islamic centuries, it lied on the caravan route linking various oases all the way up to the Libyan border. Much of its soil is cultivated thanks to a large number of freshwater springs, which, along with the remains of temples and castles, today comprise a major tourist attraction. Unlike such natural and human-made features, pigeon towers, like the one shown here, only draw the eye of the most keenly interested traveler or scholar, such as myself. Such structures often serve as collective guano production sites for villages, and thus, to borrow Jean Lozac and Georges Hugues' wonderful expression, they function as, quote, fellah, or agricultural fortresses in the fields. So that's beautiful. Fellah, fortresses in the fields. And that's exactly what they are. Constructed by specialist builders, these earthen and rather sculptural edifices require expertise, energy, and expense, including the acquisition and embedding of large ceramic vessels, a topic to which I will return shortly. Moreover, at the structural level, they appear as if truncated pyramids, ornamented at their tops with pots, bells, or finials, which, like the other surface motifs created by the clay vessels, perches, and the lime wash at the bottom, again against pests, help guide the homing birds back to their abodes. So the patterns that you see on this bird tower, every single bird tower has different patterns so the birds can recognize their home. Clay pots are also embedded in the pigeon towers of the Fayoum oasis, whose purpose and appearance differ from those of Dakhla. Typically, several horizontal superstructures are placed atop houses on planks or palms. Their integration into domestic architecture bespeaks their more restricted use as points of guano collection to enrich the soil of privately owned gardens rather than village fields or collective lands. As can be seen in this Fayoumi dovecote photographed in 1996, the pigeon entry holes are once again made of clay pots, here sliced into cylindrical passageways for them to enter the structure. This technique differs substantially from the lattice entry holes and brickwork patterns of the Iranian pigeon houses, revealing the extent to which local resources and material practices influence avian architecture across the Islamic world. So the Egyptian towers are very different from the Iranian towers, from the shape of the edifice to the materials that are used. The clay pots still embedded in the structures today attest to long-lasting pigeon homing agricultural practices that stretch back at least 2 millennia. Besides Iron Age archaeological evidence strewn across the Middle East, an important depiction of dovecotes in the so-called Nile or Palestrina mosaic provides further information from around 100 BC. This large Roman mosaic floor depicts an exotic Nile landscape and Egyptian rituals and temples, as well as boating and farming scenes. So This is a fantastical Nile scene. Here are the waters. Here are some boats. And what I'm going to do now is zoom in to this detail in the lower right corner. In addition, the mosaic includes in that corner a depiction of a pigeon tower, so from 100 BC. The scene shows a number of individuals tending to a farm estate, including a man standing at a gate and a woman busily tending to an activity within an arched wooden fence. Nearby, a pigeon house exhibits awning-like perches that are made out of branches right here, and several tiers of entrance holes, while a number of black and white pigeons fly about. So multi-tiered pigeon house with entry holes. Here are some black pigeons, and here are some white pigeons. The inclusion of the pigeon house in the Palestrina mosaic suggests the importance of pigeon raising and pigeon guano in Roman period Egypt, itself confirmed by a variety of Latin texts that make mention of something widely known as the dovecote tax, which is similar to the pigeon guano tax of Iran later on. Archaeological evidence, also from the Fayum oasis, further suggests that pigeon towers functioned as adjuncts to farmsteads, where the birds' droppings ensured the vitality of vineyards and gardens, and that they often topped storage rooms and granaries in particular. For instance, the Greco-Roman Fayumi city of Karanis, active between the 1st century BC and the 5th century CE, used to preserve about half a dozen dovecotes, each of which measured about 14 meters in height and contained up to 1,500 nests each. Those nests were not brick alcoves, but rather ceramic vessels, as is the case for the sliced pots that serve as entry holes for the pigeon houses in the Fayum and in Dakhla. These craft artifacts nonetheless fulfilled another purpose in the Karanis dovecote. Here, the intact globular vessels, and I hope you can see these huge ceramic amphora-like vessels, they're just smashed right into these thick walls, are set horizontally into the masonry, facing the inside of the tower, so the inside courtyard of the tower, with the small mouth of the vessel serving as a single pigeon entrance hole into the body of the pot, which is then big enough, expands to house 2 pigeons. Ceramic nest pots and pot holes inserted into avian architecture thus provide a craft continuum within the domain of Egyptian avian architecture stretching across millennia. Just like lime washing, nest pots make an appearance in the Roman agricultural texts that were written by Varro, Columella, and again Palladius. These Roman authors refer to them using the precise term fictilia columbaria, which means earthen, clay, or pottery dove nest. Palladius, in particular, notes that these nest holes must be placed within the structure in order to keep birds safe from weasels. Stretching all the way up to the 20th century, local Fayumis refer to these ceramic pigeon pots as kadous, a term that is derived from the Greek word kados, which means bucket, vessel, or jar. The Arabic kadus has served as a versatile multi-purpose storage jar in the Middle East throughout the centuries, as for example, a pot in water lifting wheels and for the storage of molasses. These ceramic crucibles thus could cater to hydraulic works, the sweet tooth, and feathered roosts, an expansive domain of craft functionality as it intersects with technological know-how. The ceramic nest pots bring us to our last example of built avian abodes. Let me stretch to that here. Namely, the wild pigeon houses located in rural Diyarbakir. So Diyarbakir, which is known in Kurdish as Ahmed, is located right here, and it's not too far from the Syrian border. So it's southeastern Turkey, and this is culturally a Kurdish area. Lying in the fertile Tigris River plain, the region has historically thrived thanks to expansive agricultural activity, above all the cultivation of watermelon, the area's most renowned products, which prior to the 20th century necessitated fertilizer in the form of guano. In Turkish, that pigeon guano is known as güvercin gübresi, but here locally in this area, the Kurds refer to it as zibil and koha right here. In order to gather the high-grade pigeon guano, Kurdish villagers in the town of Simaki, also known as Erimli, which you see here, and also the town of Tilalo, which is known as Karaçalı in Turkish, built structures to house the birds, as you can see right here. This is a birdhouse that's overlooking the Tigris River Valley, which is where the watermelons are grown. According to Turkish scholar Ayhan Bekleyen, there used to exist 383 dovecotes in 17 villages around the city of Diyarbakir, but by 2006, only 24 remained. During my visit last fall, I saw only about a dozen structures, with only 2 or 3 at most still in operation, and this is one of them. These bird and guano structures, thus one could argue, are under really serious pressure, much like organic farming, bird populations, and even their Kurdish custodians. Such nested concerns regarding endangerment aside, Bekleyen and others refer to these structures as guano houses, whose mud brick walls require yearly repair, so replastering every year because of rain and the elements. Their upper portions include entry holes for birds, and those are strengthened by wooden planks to avert structural collapse. So notice here that we have these planks to make sure that you don't have sort of the weight of the whole collapsing because these are still mud earth architecture. The roof itself also includes wooden beams and a layer of hay, while nowadays, if they're still maintained and in use, you will notice an addition of plastic tarp on the roofs here. Here's the tarp, to make sure that you have an extra sealant against rain infiltration and therefore structural damage. Within the structures, poplar wood poles by far and large determine the width of the interior spaces. They also strengthen the lateral walls, right? They're kind of like flying buttresses, and they offer the resident birds elevated perches. So these are flying buttresses and perches for the birds. Besides these intramural flying supports, the walls also display many wooden pegs or poles that are distributed throughout. And the pegs are these little guys right here. Notice a peg here, here, another one here, here, and we've got some pegs over here. Today, almost all of these pegs hover empty in midair, leaving the odd visitor, and there aren't that many of them here, to hypothesize that they might function as small perches as well. However, this was not the case. In the past century or two, these pegs in fact supported baskets made of willow branches that numbered in the thousands and served as suspended pigeon nests. Turkish scholars refer to these items as both baskets or sepet and nest or yuva. So maybe I could call them yuva sepeti in Turkish. But instead, what I'd like to propose is that we call them little nests in Kurmanji or nook, based on my conversations with members of the Kurdish community there. Well, I myself found only a single extant nest basket suspended to the wall last year, The poles and baskets remain encrusted on the floors, point to pigeon nest basket weaving on a mass scale in the region. So the only nest that I saw still hanging was this one. The rest of them were just encrusted on the floor in disarray. These dangling basket nests thus join the brick alcoves of Iran and the ceramic pots of Egypt to provide pigeons with a range of avian cribs based on regional resources and craft traditions, a multimedia approach to domestic bird architecture that finds echoes in the dwellings of humans as well. To come full circle, my talk today offered but a surface flyby of a much larger corpus of birdhouses in the Islamic world that requires continued study and interpretation. For now, though, I wish to put forth two questions whose preliminary answers may help us articulate some closing thoughts as well as agitate some other questions in the future. These two interrogations are as follows. First, why should this material be considered Islamic art? And second, why do dwellings for birds and dung depots even matter? Regarding the former, I concede that these nooks, crannies, and houses are not architectural masterpieces. They required no genius architect, no access to expensive or exotic resources, no financial backing by an imperial polity, and no human occupants. And yet they telescope architectural knowledge and practice in highly creative and resourceful ways, maximizing space, creating defensive strategies, and providing useful ornamentation that speaks to the various cultures, including avian aesthetic cultures, that have historically thrived in different areas of the Islamic world. They thus can be subsumed under the rubric of Islamic art, flexing its contours to finally include our wild neighbors and our shared lands. The latter issue brings me to my second question, namely why birdhouses should matter and to what future prospects they might hold the key. If used solely as sanctuaries and refuges, then these avian himmas force us to turn our attention away from our own selves to focus on the survival and well-being of non-human animals, thereby precipitating the potential for interspecies harmony, well-being, and reconciliation, or islah. This coming together involves organic matter and nature itself, as well as local communities who, like bird populations and vegetal matter, are vulnerable to all manner of outside forces. These birdhouses therefore chisel and stand tall as biomaterial contributions to an integrated creaturely world in which biodiversity is not just the thriving of life in its greatest variety, but also an artistic mandate to ensure a long-term sustainability of life for all. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Gruber. And that was such an interesting and enlightening presentation. I'll just remind our participants, if you have a question, please enter it in the Q&A box below your screen. And I have a couple questions to kick it off until I see some in the entered in the chat. I wanted to ask you about the terms himma and islah. And obviously, we don't have an English corollary to those words. I was trying to think of what English terms we would use, and I thought of, in bird, the Audubon chapter, we say habitat and conservation a lot, but those are very material words, whereas Hima and Isla are more transcendent. And I just wanted to ask you if you think um, the English language or Western concept, where all of our language around birds and biodiversity and interspecies harmony is rooted in the scientific lexicon, if that's a somewhat limiting framework, and wondering if you could speak to that a little bit.
That's a beautiful, beautiful question. And I would say you really put your finger on something very important. In our terminology, we tend to scientify and medicalize non-humans, and with the notion of green corridors and biodiversity and habitat and conservation, we lose what you've called, in fact, that transcendental meaning of life. Which is in a way divesting it of the patina of the sacred. And oftentimes, if something is invested with transcendental forms of whatever we perceive as the sacred, will be more propelled to maintain its life. And so, what's interesting for the Arabic terms is that Hima is a sanctuary and a refuge, but it also refers to an area that's cordoned off where you can't undertake any killings and you can't destroy any trees. And therefore, already in pre-Islamic Arabia, but definitely in the early Islamic period, Himma is equivalent to the environmental commons, actually. So that starts very early on. And the reason for that is um, there's a concept of just war. And during the early Islamic period, wars were happening, battles were happening in palm groves. And the ultimate decimation of a community would be to burn down their palm grove, because that's the only place where they can live. The rest is desert. And so there is that conservation that is also required for the sustenance of human life, concurrent with everything that comes with it. And of course, trees come with birds. You get rid of the trees, you don't have birds. And then the term Islah I find particularly interesting, because that tends to be applied in the Islamic tradition as something that happens between two humans. And it's related to the term sulh, which is peace, the seeking of peace. So reconciliation is peacemaking as well. So what I've done is actually taken that term, reconciliation, which is peacemaking, and I've actually expanded it to include peacemaking with an interlocutor that's not a human. And of course, peace has transcendental meaning as well in Islamic traditions. So we think of ourselves as terribly modern, and that modernity should be mathematical and scientific and devoid of the mythical, of the unexplainable, that it has to have taxonomies and certainties. But what I think would be important, and this is what these terms do, is that they reinfuse a certain amount of ambivalence and ambiguity and sacrality to our landscapes. And so it gives it that different patina than our Western models. I hope that answers your question.
It does, yes. And I just also wanted to ask if, going back to some of your earlier slides, if you could maybe, I know you touched on this, and I'm not an art historian, but if you could um, just emphasize what the significance of art uh, and artistic expression within the dovecotes is, as opposed to like a purely functional structure, and what you think that signifies in terms of Hima or Islah.
Yeah, that's also a really great question, because today it's really easy, especially with the pigeon houses of Iran, to really aestheticize these structures because they're empty. So all you see is this kaleidoscopic, network from the inside. And when you look up photos online, if you just go to Google Images, it's like op art, and it's mesmerizing, and it's postmodern, and it's minimalistic. And so we have a tendency to aestheticize these buildings as pieces of modern art. Now, they do have that aesthetic, but when they were built, some very instrumental choices were made, which was how many of these cubbyholes can we get into this structure in a small space, and also not using too many materials. And so they're maximizing space and minimizing materials, and the result is actually aesthetically pleasing. But when they're inhabited, these bird towers, you have to imagine the inside being extremely chaotic. It's filled with all of these birds. There's guano droppings on the ground. You've got cooing. If you have a predator comes in, then it's mass chaos and confusion. And so I would say there isn't a very fine line between the functional and aesthetic, because I see those sort of weaving in and out of each other. And surely also the artisans were aiming for aesthetic proportions and features. And in the case of Cappadocia, there's a lot of art that's painted in and around those cubby holes. So the holes were drawing the attention of really interesting, creative, and self-reflexive activity, because when you look at all of the designs that are actually aesthetically painted, it's like a roster of the arts in that area, kind of like a guidebook to the flat weave carpets, the cypress trees that are growing, the sword and shield dancing. You also get wonderful Arabic script calligraphy and so on. So I would say it's both aesthetic and functional. Sometimes it's one more than the other, and sometimes I know it's not neither, because they're always functional and there's always something beautiful about them, I would say. Yeah.
I have another follow-up question. Um, well, we have a question from Tyler. In the places you visited and described, is there a feeling of nostalgia toward the dove houses, or are they seen as outdated and not worth maintaining?
That's a really good question too, Tyler. The answer is both. So when I was in Cappadocia, I spoke to quite a few people, and they were very nostalgic for those clouds of doves. They felt like it added so much beauty to this wild lunar landscape. And the doves are still there, but not in very large quantities. So they feel like a whole aspect of that culture, which was a culture that was flying overhead and penetrating the walls, has diminished considerably. So there's nostalgia. Um, but it many others, especially in Iran and Turkey, where many of these structures are now abandoned, feel that it's a little bit outdated and not worth maintaining. So a number of these birdhouses are not maintained. Uh, they're in poor condition, and they look a little bit like carcasses in some areas. The reason for that is uh, many countries in the Islamic world played catch up and believe that modern fertilizers and mass agriculture and industrialization are the way to go, mass industrialization. And so those were abandoned, and then they have different sort of modern cultures of agriculture popping up, and that includes the penetration of cement into these oases. But now, more recently, now that they've seen how mass agriculture has actually decimated the soil and polluted the waters, and how cement leaves behind rubble and destroys the environment as opposed to mud brick, which just degenerates, organically. I'm seeing also in a few places individuals who are actually reviving the bird towers, like the one I showed you in the Kurdish area. Remember, I said there are two or three that are still active. Those are run by a woman with whom I had a conversation. She sells her guano, which is organic pigeon fertilizer, to producers of vegetables and fruits who specialize in organic produce. And those who purchase those items want organic produce. And so I'm seeing an uptick now in the maintenance of those structures, because there's now increasing demand in the Islamic world as well for organic produce, now that we know that processed foods and these chemical fertilizers are actually not good for us epigenetically. So it's all of those, and I think we're going to see some flicking of the spectrum. My hope is that they will be revived. Maybe it will replenish bird populations. It will bring income to some minority communities like the Amazigh, the Berbers, and the Kurds. And it will make much better produce. The watermelons are much more delicious with bird guano, and the end result is win-win, because humans will be healthier through organic produce. So it's a nested ecology. So that I hope that answers that question too.
I have a follow-up question to that. Um, it seems like some of, especially the rural examples of avian architecture, seem to represent like a deep local knowledge as well as a deep understanding of avian ecology and their life histories and biological needs. And you mentioned like an integrated worldview and how we've become so much more like our disciplines have become so siloed. And I'm wondering if in the contemporary architecture world you're seeing any return to that more integrated worldview or an understanding of biodiversity that would maybe return some of these concepts to contemporary architecture.
There's a big movement, I would say, underfoot in the Islamic world. And that's a movement that many people refer to as Green Islam. I've also seen it called Green Deen, Deen meaning faith, so the Deen of Islam. So Green Deen is a lovely term expression. And there are groups also called Muslim environmentalists. The UK has a very important group of Muslim environmentalists that also put out a manual on greening your Hajj. So the pilgrimage, of course, is a huge carbon footprint. And so now Muslims are themselves looking inside to the Islamic reservoir of traditions to regreen their traditions because the belief in the Green Deen movement is that these green principles are already inherently there. They've been forgotten or overlaid with maybe some other priorities or prerogatives over time. And so it's a question of bringing them out and recentering the green principles that are believed to be already inherent in the deen or in the faith of Islam. And I think that's only going to grow more and more as climate change continues to force people to really think seriously about these issues.
That reminds me of in the UK, there's a big movement to pass legislation requiring Swift bricks in new construction. I don't know if you've seen Swift bricks, but it's like if you're building a brick house or a brick building, um, every X number has to have like a little hole for a Swift to roost in.
Mhm.
And that seems like it might fit into the concept of Hima as a contemporary example.
That's exactly right. And now you can buy bee bricks, by the way, which are bricks with perforations for bees. And I just saw that recently in Turkey they started selling bee bricks as well. Um, So yeah, there's also the question of the bee population. And by the way, Cappadocia, most people don't know this. They look at all of the bird holes, but I went with a specialist tour guide, and he said, "Come with me. Nobody knows this, but in this corner, there's also the same thing for bees, and you can hardly see it, but it's a bunch of pricks in a corner, and actually." The rocks are also inhabited by bees, so there's the production of honey as well.
That's amazing.
Yeah.
And for those of you in the Twin Cities, I took a historic walking tour of the Bryant neighborhood, and they do have an example of a house that was originally constructed by the family with the last name Martin, and they specifically constructed a little Martin house um, under the eaves of their front wall, and it had the monogram M for their last name and the Purple Martins. And so I highly recommend that walking tour if you get a chance. And it was probably the first time I actually really noticed avian architecture, and I hope you get a chance to see it. This might be a leading question, but the dovecoats with the carpet, in repeating carpet designs, do those offer any insights into the gender identity of the artists?
Probably not. I mean, carpets tend to be woven and knotted by women and young girls. And so the fabric arts tend to be female associated, just like the handicrafts in general. But in the case of Cappadocia, it's most likely that the painters who are climbing all the way up were men, and so I'm not sure I'd want to give it a gendered dimension. But what's interesting with the carpets is that many of those carpet designs you see painted are the same on the carpets that are made by women, and that actually become designs of the walls and the floors inside the cubby holes of humans that were also carved into the rock. And so, to me, what's really interesting is how similar actually the abodes of humans and birds are or were in Cappadocia. They're extremely similar, actually.
Thank
There's
you.
another question by an anonymous attendee, and
Yeah.
that's actually a question that I would want to put out to the audience because I've never seen American or New World equivalents of providing housing to animals or housing to birds, let's say, in exchange for their byproducts, unless you consider, you know, the meat producing industry. I mean, all these animals are housed in places and, their products are used. Marion, can you think of anything?
I can't think of any in the New World. They're all the examples are linked to indigenous cultures. And I think
No.
like
I don't know
I
if
guess a beehive, a beekeeping would be um but that's still within the realm of husbandry, I think,
yeah,
where your talk specifically differentiated between a husbandry purpose that you saw in Europe or the UK and in the Middle East.
that's right. Because these birdhouses were not to get access to, pigeon meat in the depths of winter when you need protein or eggs. They were there for the guano, by far and large. Um, Not exclusively, sometimes pigeons are eaten, especially in Egypt, where it's a delicacy. But I'm having trouble thinking of examples of birdhouses that are built on the American continent, um, in a similar fashion. But I don't know that corpus very well, and there might be some indigenous examples of that. But that I would love to find out if anybody knows.
If anyone knows, feel free to type it in the chat or as a question. Um, we have a question from Alexandra who says, I'll let you all decide how contentious you're feeling, but perhaps this is an opportunity to talk about habitat loss in Gaza. I'm thinking about the trees. Um,
Where do you see that? Because I don't see it in Q&A.
it's the last one. It's right below anonymous attendee.
Oh, I have to scroll. There we go. Habitat loss in Gaza, thinking about the trees. Yeah, I mean, we're gonna steer clear of politics because Gaza, makes everybody really incensed these days. What I can say is that in warfare, and this is the case in Palestine, you do see, and I mentioned this earlier in the early Islamic period, the cutting down of palm trees as a today we might call it a war crime, but it's a war strategy. Um, what makes me sad in these situations is that olive trees are cut en masse, and olive trees, as many of you know, live for hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years. They're like great great grandfathers and ancestors. I've seen olive trees that are 800 years old on the Eastern Mediterranean, and it's not just war. You might remember this summer there were all these wildfires because of climate change all around the Mediterranean, and entire hillsides of olive groves in Italy, out of all places, just burned to the ground. And so we're looking at the loss of trees, but we're also looking at the loss, and in this case, of olive trees, which is a major staple resource for humans as well. So I think trees and birds are always deeply connected, and humans and trees are also deeply connected, just as humans and birds are too. And hopefully there'll be enough space for everyone to thrive safely, no matter whether you're human or non-human or however you identify. That's kind of how I see it.
Well, I think that's a really lovely way to end this presentation, and I wanted to thank our all of our attendees from tonight for taking some time out of your evening. And I especially wanted to thank Dr. Gruber for sharing this wonderful presentation. And it was so enlightening and just a new lens to think about the built environment and how we care for our avian friends.
Thank you so much for this invitation. Thank you guys for these great questions. They're going to help me chisel this chapter, and now I really want to find out if I'm missing anything on the American continent too. And Marion, if you find out anything, please let me know.
I
So
will.
thank you. Thank you so much. This was wonderful.
Thank you. Take care.
Bye. Have a good evening, everybody.